Hey everybody, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. If you're watching these videos, you're either enrolled in my class or you're in someone else's class, but you find them helpful, hopefully, or you stumbled across them on YouTube. If you're not in my class, please learn all the details the way your instructors want you to learn it. I'm going to present the information the way that I want my students to learn it. I go in and add more detail later on as time goes on. So we're in laboratory right now, and we're going to be studying the anatomy of the heart. I have a nice huge heart model here for us to look at. If you are in my class and you have your list of things to know or your laboratory guide, we're going to be on page 13 and we're going to continue on to page 14 as we study all the structures of the heart. I'm going to try to go in the order of the list, but I may not. I may do some structures a little bit out of order, but they're all on here on the list. So now, this is an anterior view of your heart, and we may be looking at the heart not only from the anterior view, but I may turn it around and look at it from a posterior view. And as I do that, I'm going to use another heart model sometimes so that I don't have to keep moving that one, okay? So I can show you an anterior view of the heart or a posterior view of the heart. On this posterior view, this light blue tube here represents the trachea, your windpipe, and two of the bronchi that are called primary bronchi. We're going to learn those when we learn the anatomy of the respiratory system, but I want them for reference because your heart sits right along where your trachea runs in your chest, and a lot of the great vessels that come out of the heart are going to run right by the trachea and have to wrap around it, okay? So I'm going to move this one aside for a moment, and let me give you a little preview. It may be in your best interest to find my video on blood flow through the heart and watch me draw blood flow through the heart, okay? That will help you understand some of the internal anatomy of the heart before we get to it. Our heart has 4 chambers and it is mostly muscle tissue. Our heart has a membrane that lines the outside of it. I don't know if you remember from early in part 1 A&P, but the serous membranes, we have a visceral and parietal pleura, a visceral and parietal pericardium, and a visceral and parietal peritoneum. Those membranes, there's a visceral and parietal layer. The visceral layer lies up against the surface of the organ. The parietal layer forms the outer wall of the cavity, or rubs the outer wall of the cavity. Now, our heart wall has 3 layers to it. There's one called the epicardium, also called the visceral pericardium. They're the same thing, epi meaning outermost. The muscular layer, the cardiac muscle, which is a thick, strong muscle, especially in the ventricles of the heart, is called the myocardium. Myo always means muscle. And the endocardium is the inner lining of the chambers of the heart, which is made out of simple squamous epithelium. It makes the walls of the heart rather smooth and glossy and slick so that red blood cells glide right off of it. We're going to be seeing those in a moment. So when we start with the anatomy of the heart, I want you guys to know that up here where all the great vessels attached, the flat part of the heart on top, if I sliced all these great vessels off, it would be very flat right there. That is called the base of the heart. So if I ask you to identify this general region of the heart or the general area, it's called the base. The very tip of the heart is referred to as the apex. Apex always means tip. And the tip of our heart points down. Actually, it points a little bit more anterior, but now, when I look at the outside of the heart, I can see part of the visceral pericardium. This yellow layer here is the epicardium or the visceral pericardium. And it would completely envelop the heart, but they cut it and reflected it or removed it so that we could see the myocardium. So this dark layer here, and on this model, they cut a small square out so that we can see that the heart muscle is actually, it's several layers of muscle. I have muscle fibers running this way, and then I'll have muscle fibers running this way, and some running this way, and all those muscle fibers help it contract and actually kind of wring, like you wringing the fluid out of a towel so that it squeezes and ejects as much blood as possible. So all of this dark layer is called the myocardium. Excuse me. Now, if I take the front of the heart off, I can see that the myocardium has a thickness to it. And in some areas of the heart, it's not quite as thick as others, like the right ventricle. So we have 4 chambers to the heart. The 2 top chambers are called atria. The 2 bottom chambers are called ventricles. The atria are pretty empty, but the ventricles have a lot of musculature and some connective tissue in here. But these, if I asked you to ID this empty space, this would be your right atrium. This would be the right ventricle, this space down here. This would be the left atrium. This would be the left ventricle. You have to remember, it's always the subject's right and left. This is my right ear. This is my left ear. It's always the mirror image of you. So right and left on the model. Now, if we look at the right ventricle, we can see that the myocardium is not quite as thick as it is in the left ventricle. And the reason is the left ventricle has to pump blood the greatest distance. It has to pump blood to your head and to your feet, to your fingers, with enough force to get all the way around and get back to the heart. The right ventricle is simply going to pump blood to the lungs and back, so it's a shorter distance. So it's not as thick and as strong. The atria are only going to top off the ventricles. When blood flows into the heart, these little dark openings in here, I don't know how well you can see these little black spots, but those are the openings of vessels draining blood into the atria. And as blood drains into the atria, these little flaps, which are called atrioventricular valves, will open and let blood start filling the ventricles due to gravity. When they're about 70% full, this little structure called the sinoatrial node will depolarize and an action potential will spread through the atria and they will contract and top the ventricles off so that they're as full as we can get them. Then when the atria relax, the ventricles will contract and eject blood out these two great vessels here. So we're going to talk about all that in lecture, but this anatomy is going to fit that. So when I open the heart up, if I look inside the two atria, this light blue lining, you see how they painted it a light blue color? That represents the endocardium. And if I look down here, it looks like someone took a can of light blue spray paint and just kind of dusted it with a little bit of paint. But all of this light blue lining, all the light blue layer, is the endocardium. So when it comes to the layers of the heart, we might ask you, ID the yellow layer or the yellow membrane or covering. That would be called the epicardium, or you could put visceral pericardium, and both terms would be correct. If I ask you to identify this dark brown layer, that layer is the myocardium. If I ask you to identify the light blue layer on the inside, that light blue layer in here is the endocardium. Okay? Now, we can define the pulmonary and systemic circuit when we're in lecture, but we can see the four chambers: right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. Okay? Now, I'm going to put the front of the heart back on, and these models are a little bit tricky in how these pieces fit together, so please bear with me. These are called the great vessels of the heart because they're the largest vessels coming out of the top of the heart. And I'm actually going to use this model also because this model is a little bit more straight up and you can kind of see them. But coming out of where the right ventricle would be, this big blue pipe coming here is known as the pulmonary trunk. Okay? The pulmonary trunk is going to deliver blood from the right ventricle up here. Now watch. As I turn it, I see a branch coming off the pulmonary trunk here. That's going to be the left pulmonary artery. It's going to carry blood to the left lung. If I flip the model around, it's hard to see, but right here next to the trachea, these two blood vessels are called the right pulmonary arteries. Now, I've switched our left and right by flipping the model around, but these two blue blood vessels are called the right pulmonary arteries. Now, in general, we say that arteries are red, veins are blue, except for the pulmonaries. So, arteries carry oxygenated blood most of the time. We learn when we study blood in lecture that there's a protein in blood called hemoglobin, and that protein is also a pigment. It will absorb all the photons of light except for those in the red spectrum when we have a lot of oxygen in the red blood cell. And they will reflect red light, so arteries usually appear red because they're carrying a lot of oxygenated blood. If I take the oxygen out of a red blood cell and put carbon dioxide on it, they start to turn a bluish color. We call it cyanin. That's why cyanosis is the bluing of us when we're lacking oxygen. And that blue color would be found mostly in veins because veins are carrying deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Okay? You have to watch the blood flow video to really understand what I'm talking about. So in general, arteries are red and veins are blue. except for the pulmonaries. It's the one exception, because when deoxygenated blood comes back to the heart on the right side, it's going to go out the pulmonary trunk to the lungs, get rid of the carbon dioxide, and become oxygenated and turn red. But because these vessels are taking blood away from the heart, they're going to be arteries, but they're going to be blue arteries. Remember that little love poem, arteries are red, veins are blue, except for the pulmonaries. Okay, so this is your pulmonary trunk, and if I follow it up, it will branch here, and it's going to split into two. And then each one of those would split into two vessels. We see the left pulmonary artery right there, but these are the two right pulmonary arteries, which would be coming off this way on this model, okay? So we see the two right pulmonary arteries. Now, as blood goes out to the lungs, it's going to come back oxygenated and red through some veins, and there's going to be 4 pulmonary veins. These two right here in red are your right pulmonary veins. The right pulmonary arteries are blue, the right pulmonary veins are red. If I rotate the model a little bit over here, I can see the left pulmonary vein, and I can see 2 left pulmonary arteries bringing blood into the left atrium there. So, sorry, I dropped my pointer. This is the left pulmonary artery. These are the left pulmonary veins. I hope you got all that, okay? Now, the large red vessel that's coming out of the front of the heart, again, this one's a little more upright, but I don't like the black base. This is the aorta coming here. Now, our heart sits a little bit to the left and a little bit twisted in our chest. And if I turn this model around, you can see that the aorta arches over here. Now, we're not going to test you on this part, but the aorta has several different regions. In the thoracic aorta, I have a part where blood is going to come up here, which is called the ascending aorta. Then it's going to arch over, and these 3 branches come off here. That's called the aortic arch. And then the aorta is going to come down the body, and it's called the descending aorta. I'm not going to ask you ascending the arch or the descending aorta. And then once it passes the diaphragm, we call it the abdominal aorta. And some people say the abdominal descending aorta, but if it's in the abdomen, we know it's descending. So now, this is all the aorta. I have the pulmonary trunk. I see the left pulmonary artery here, the right pulmonary arteries on the other side, and there's the aorta. Now, after the aorta, we have the superior and the inferior vena cava. So, if I turn the heart back a little bit this way, this is the superior vena cava here. This large vessel coming out of the heart like this. So, if I were to just learn them in order, it's superior vena cava, the aorta, and the pulmonary trunk. SAP, superior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk. Superior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk. Now, to see the inferior vena cava, it's going to come from underneath the heart. And the inferior vena cava, I have to lift the model off the stand. So I have another model here that if I lifted it off the stand and we were looking at it from behind, you would see this blue vessel right here is the inferior vena cava leading into the right atrium. I can see the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava both come into the right atrium here and deliver blood to it, okay? The next structure on the list is called the auricles, and there's a right auricle and a left auricle. The term auricle means ear, and they look like little pig's ears to me, or a little dog ear. These little pink structures that are flapped over on the heart are called the auricles. And again, since that's the left and this is the right, this would be the left auricle, this would be the right auricle, or the left auricle and right auricle, okay? You may have to indicate right or left on the lab test, and the question will say, identify the pink structure, please indicate right or left in your answer, and you would have to say left auricle or right auricle, depending on which one we point to, okay? So, the next structure on your list after the auricles is called the ligamentum arteriosum. So look, everybody's seen those little kid toys that you hook up to your water hose and the hoses flap around and spray water everywhere. Under pressure, hoses can flop and move around. When our left and right ventricle contract, they're going to squeeze blood out the pulmonary trunk and out the aorta under a tremendous amount of pressure. If they weren't locked down and they flopped over, they could kink, and that kink would stop blood flow temporarily. We cannot have a decrease in blood flow to our tissues. We have a constant oxygen demand. So Mother Nature tied the aorta to the pulmonary trunk, which is attached to the heart, with this piece of connective tissue here. This little light blue band is called the ligamentum arteriosum. That's the ligamentum arteriosum. Now, well, I'll talk about the ligamentum arteriosum again in a little bit. Now, the next structure I want to show you is on the inside of the heart. I'm going to open this heart model up, and if I look between the atria, there's a little wall here next to the aorta, and that wall wraps around the aorta and is here. That wall is the wall between the atria. Since the word septum means divider, that's called the interatrial septum. This is your interatrial septum, just this wall right here. This wall down here between the ventricles is called the interventricular septum, which literally means the wall between the ventricles. So if I ask you to ID this structure, or ID this structure, the wall, interatrial septum, interventricular septum, okay? Now, when I look inside the interatrial septum, if I look from a certain angle, I hope you can see this, there's a little oval spot right here. That oval spot is called the fossa ovalis. Fossa means depression, and it's oval. So, the fossa ovalis is there because when we are in the womb, we get our oxygenated blood not from breathing, but from mom through the umbilical cord. And as the umbilical cord delivers blood into you, it's going to come into the atrium through the inferior vena cava. So we actually, in the womb, are getting oxygenated blood instead of deoxygenated blood here. And that oxygenated blood could go through this valve into the ventricle and back out. And some of the blood can bypass this. Since it's already oxygenated, we need to send some to the lungs to feed the lungs oxygen for growth and development. But this fossa ovalis is actually open as a little hole called the foramen ovale. If you've ever heard of a baby being born with a hole in their heart, the hole is not in the outer wall where they'd spurt blood out and bleed to death. The hole is right here where the fossa ovalis is. Sometimes it does not close completely. So in fetal circulation, in a fetus, this is open as the foramen ovale. Oxygenated blood comes in, goes right through here into the left atrium, through the left ventricle, and is delivered to our tissues. Also, some of the blood will come out the aorta, and because some of the blood that's going here is already oxygenated and goes through the right ventricle, and then comes out the pulmonary trunk here, since it's already oxygenated, we can divert some of that blood through this opening into the aorta. So this is, and when we're in the womb, this is not completely filled in with connective tissue. It is not called the ligamentum arteriosum. It's called a ductus arteriosus because it's a duct or tube that's open and blood can flow through there. So in fetal circulation, oxygenated blood will come into the right atrium. Some of the blood goes through the foramen ovale to the left atrium. It can bypass all of this. And any of the blood that comes out of the right ventricle that's already oxygenated can go straight through the ductus arteriosus, and we can feed blood to our tissues. When we are born, the ductus arteriosus, it's called patent when it's open. So you'll hear about babies being born with PDAs, which is a patent ductus arteriosus, and it hasn't closed. The problem then is the baby's getting deoxygenated blood mixed with oxygenated blood, and we're not delivering enough oxygen to our tissues, and the babies can experience cyanosis or look blue. They're called blue babies. And very often, they may not survive if we can't get the oxygen right. So surgeons can go in and close this off or close off the foramen ovale. Okay? So those are two important structures in fetal circulation. Now, I'm going to cover a little bit more here. Let's see. The pectinate muscles are some muscle fibers that are in the walls of the atrium here. You see these little muscle fibers. I tend not to ask the pectinate muscles, so if you're in my class, you can scratch that off the list. but you might hear of angina pectinis. Angina pectinis is pain in the heart, and it's in the pectinate muscles or associated with them. The trabeculae carni and the trabeculae carni are this. Carne means meat, and trabeculae are the crisscross struts of spongy bone that we studied in part 1. But if I had those struts made out of meat, then they would be called trabeculae carni or trabeculae carni. And if you look inside the ventricles, at the floor of the ventricles, there's all these little crisscross pieces of muscle tissue going across here. And what they do is when they contract, they also help squeeze the muscle in and pull the walls together. But those are called trabeculae carni, all these little crisscross pieces of muscle tissue. The moderator band is a band of tissue excuse me, that helps moderate our cardiac rhythm by stretching here. And I'm not going to show it to you on our model, so I'm not going to worry about it. So now, if you're following on the list of things to know, we're on page 14. Okay? We're going to talk about the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. Our heart has 4 valves in it, and they are one-way valves, so that blood can flow from one direction to another, but not backwards. When the atria contract, these 2 little V-shaped structures will open and let blood flow into the atria. Actually, they're already open and blood falls into the ventricles. I said atria, but blood will start to fill the ventricles due to gravity, and then the atria contract and top them off all the way full. When the ventricles get ready to eject blood, the atria are going to relax and the ventricles will squeeze. Well, I don't want these flaps to blow backwards. I want blood to go only out the pulmonary trunk or out the aorta to deliver blood downstream. So this little structure, this little V-shaped structure right here is called the right atrioventricular valve. The right atrioventricular valve has 3 flaps to it, and they're cusp-shaped. So it's also called the tricuspid valve. You could say, if I asked you to identify that structure, you could say right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve. You don't, you're going to have to spell out atrioventricular. Now, we will say AV valve, but you have to spell it out, okay? Sorry, my light turns off after a few minutes because of an automatic timer. Now, this is the left atrioventricular valve, this little V-shaped structure here. The left atrioventricular valve has 2 alternate names. Because it only has 2 cusps, it's also called the bicuspid valve. Tricuspid is on the right, bicuspid is on the left. When he left, he said bi. Okay. Now, it's also called the mitral valve. So if I ask you to identify the structure that opens here, you could say left atrioventricular valve, bicuspid valve, or mitral valve, and any of those 3 answers would be accepted. Okay. Now, when blood makes it into these pipes, if it tries to flow backwards into here, we don't want any backward flow of blood. So there's some flaps at the base of the aorta, and they're kind of hard to see. So I'm going to hold up this model, and hopefully you can see these little flaps here represent the aortic valve, also called the aortic semilunar valve, or the left semilunar valve. You can just simply call it the aortic valve. Okay. Now, the pulmonary valve is at the base of the pulmonary trunk, which is at the front of the right ventricle. So if I flip this heart over and look inside here, there's a valve inside there that represents what we call the right semilunar valve, or the pulmonary semilunar valve, or you could simply say pulmonary valve. They're dropping the semilunar from the name, but that's the pulmonary valve inside of there. You're looking at the front of the heart from an internal view, and in the right ventricle, there's the pulmonary valve. Okay. Now, when our heart contracts, the ventricles are going to squeeze with so much force, it could blow those valves backwards, almost like, restaurant doors that can go in either direction. We don't want that. So Mother Nature put some muscles in the floor of the ventricles that stick up. And these little sort of pyramid or triangular shaped muscles that stick up here are called papillary muscles. And when the ventricles contract, the papillary muscles pull down and pull this way. And they're connected to these long, thin lines here that are called chordae tendineae, tendinous cords. The chordae tendineae are attached to the flaps of the valve. So when the ventricles contract, the papillary muscles pull down and pull those chordae tendineae tight to prevent the valves from being blown backwards. When the ventricles relax, the valves will open. When the ventricles contract, the valves will close, the papillary muscles pull down, and the chordae tendineae hold those valves from blowing backwards. So papillary muscle, chordae tendineae. Papillary muscles, chordae tendineae. Okay? Now, we've covered a lot of structures. I want you to take some time to digest that. I know I mixed in a little bit of lecture and lab together. It's very hard to do without doing so. I am going to have Dr. Jones's videos posted as well, and she just goes straight through the anatomy. If you like my videos, watch mine. If you like hers, watch hers. But I'm going to have both of them on my Canvas page. I hope you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did. We still have a little bit more heart to do, and then we'll do wireman. Anyway, thanks for watching. Start working this stuff. Print the pictures and practice till you can't stand it. Practice until you understand it, and then do it 5 more times to guarantee your A. Print these pictures, put them in a plastic sheet, and start labeling and erase it with an erasable marker and an eraser, and label and erase and label and erase. All right, thanks for watching. See you in the next video.